I most emphatically state that I am not guilty. I made a statement to the police which is true in substance and in fact. I don't wish to say anything further in this court or to call any witnesses. Those are the words of George Stagg, set out in records from his appearance in court, charged with the murder of footballer Tommy Ball. Ball was an aspiring international player at the world's most successful football club when he was shot and killed on November the 11th, 1923. We have heard over previous episodes how the tragedy impacted Ball's widow and his teammates and changed the course of Aston Villa's season and potentially their future trajectory for decades. Now it's time for the incredible story of George Stagg, the man who fired the fatal shot. A father, a former policeman, a man who had abandoned his career for his country, and one of millions who carried deep physical and mental trauma from serving in the horror of the trenches of World War I. And we'll hear an account of the death of Tommy Ball, which has been largely lost to history. You're listening to The Murder That Changed English Football, allegedly. This is episode 4, The Old Soldier. It's difficult to know where to start in describing the life of George Stagg, which pulls together so many threads of the changing times as Victorian Britain gave way to the world order that is familiar to us today. On the night he was awakened from a snooze, when his neighbour and tenant Tommy Ball startled his dog, Stagg was facing acute family, psychological, probably financial, and even physical challenges. Let's start with his family. Stagg was the sole breadwinner for a family of 5. Well, strictly it had just become a family of 4, because his eldest son, also named George, was aboard a ship headed for a new life in Australia. The family would have known that they would unlikely ever be reunited. The breakup must have been hugely traumatic, but the family had other issues to deal with. The children's mother, Mary, had suffered from diabetes since childhood. In the same year that Tommy Ball was shot, insulin was first licensed as a treatment, but it's unlikely Mary Stagg would have had access until the advent of the National Health Service in 1948. A lack of treatment for her condition would have led to a range of deteriorating symptoms, including poor eyesight and mobility issues, as well as the short-term impacts of unmanaged blood sugar. And Mr. Stagg too suffered a number of health conditions. On top of a war wound in his leg, which gave him a severe limp, health records also point to some kind of lung condition, possibly as a result of having contracted tuberculosis. Official documents list him as being 80% disabled. This left him unable to work and earn a living, and would have caused deep mental scars. For a man whose youth had been spent travelling the world on active duty for his country, the sudden transition to a weak and vulnerable invalid must have been acutely painful. It's one reason why he might have been reluctant to step outside his home on a dark night without the comfort of a trusty shotgun. On the night of Sunday the 11th of November, 1923, it's certain that Stagg had other reasons for anxiety and unease. That day was the first time since the end of the war that Armistice Day had fallen on a Sunday. It therefore carried particular national significance. Everyone in the country would have known friends killed in the fighting. But with a background in the army going back decades, Stagg would undoubtedly have lost far more than most. He had been just 17 when he first signed up to the Royal Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment in 1895. He served in Sudan under General Kitchener, who's almost universally known today for his mustachioed call to arms in the World War I recruitment poster, "Your country needs you." During that campaign in Africa, Stagg faced fearless but poorly equipped native forces known by the British as dervishes, fighting at the notorious Battle of Omdurman when British machine guns and artillery mowed down thousands of the advancing enemy. Stagg would have seen the importance of capitalising on the advantage of firepower before your enemy has chance to close hand to hand. Those times were formative for many young men, among them 2 leaders who fought alongside Stagg that day: Winston Churchill and the former commander of the British Army, Douglas Haig. Stagg left the army around the turn of the century to find work first as a railway porter and then joined the Birmingham police force as PC 127. He would have patrolled the area around Villa Park, marshalling the crowds on their way in and hearing the roars that would accompany the frequent home goals. The work was steady and respectable. His earnings would rise to £1.16 per week. Remember, his tenant Tommy Ball was on £7 plus a bonus, but it was still a decent wage. Stagg seems to have been a difficult man, stubborn perhaps. He faced a disciplinary procedure for speaking insolently to a superior officer in 1914. A few months later, shortly after the outbreak of war, he simply walked out of his job without telling his employer and signed up for the army. This was an impetuous decision and could have been a very costly one, as it put at threat his police pension. He does seem to have been able to regularise things, formally resigning in 1915, but even that meant his family would forego the payments due to a policeman killed in action. It also left him without a job to come home to. At the time, he was just 36. Stagg may have been considered lucky to have caught a blighty, or a non-life-threatening wound that would see him invalided out of the horrors of trench warfare. At the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in 1915, a German bullet passed through his calf. The injury was serious enough that even with the country desperate for manpower as the war ground on, he was never sent back to the front. But while Stagg himself survived, he would have heard constant reports of friends and colleagues whose lives were sacrificed, including his brother. On top of that, his sister, mother, and mother-in-law all died between 1917 and the fateful day in 1923. In addition, remember that Stagg's eldest son had just left to emigrate to Australia. It's obvious, therefore, that Stagg would have been traumatised by his experience of seeing others die, probably even from shots he fired, and losing members of his own family and many friends. All of that pain would have been focused on November the 11th, 1923, the first time that Armistice Day fell on a Sunday, a day of reflection when other distractions were removed. This is important to remember when we recall how Stagg must have been feeling at 10 p.m. that night as he is awakened from a snooze by his dog barking an alert. It's a detail which didn't come up in his trials because the prosecution was careful not to question Stagg's character, which would have allowed his team to call witnesses to testify to the service he'd given his country and the price he had paid. Stagg's military training must have had an influence, as before stepping out of his back door he reaches for his shotgun, presumably loading a cartridge as he steps into the chill night darkness. At some point, he becomes aware of a presence on the other side of his fence. At that time, on that day, in that place, there is no reason for an innocent passerby to have been wandering past, yards off the road, on a path which led nowhere except to Stagg's gate. Blood pumping and gripping the barrel of his rifle, we don't know how long it is before Stagg realises the intruder is not an unknown menace, but his neighbour. The neighbour who has continued a simmering dispute with the Stagg family for months. The neighbour come home late from the pub again. Looking at a photograph of Stagg from his army re-enlistment in 1914, it's easy to imagine him being a man with a temper. His huge, shaped moustache speaks of discipline and an intolerance for disorder or untidiness. His uniform, including his Highland kilt and tight-fitting Glengarry bonnet, are impeccable in this sepia image. It's likely that the conversation starts on an aggressive note. Neither man wants to be out in the cold. Both are irritated. Ball has been drinking. Stagg's just woken from sleep and his dog is barking furiously. Stagg's account of the exchange is more consistent than Beatrice Ball's throughout the trials. Here's the essence of it. "Get him back to bed or I'll bash your bloody brains out," Ball shouts. As Bull makes to climb the gate, Stagg, conscious of his physical infirmity and the vulnerability of his wife and 2 young children, especially following the recent emigration of their son, fires a warning shot. He then hobbles back inside to collect a second cartridge and reload, emerging again to find Bull once more in the process of climbing the back gate. That gate, remember, would have come up to Bull's chest and would have offered only smooth vertical planks with no foothold. Still, for an athletic footballer, it cannot have been a significant obstacle. Stagg pushes Bull back, using the barrel of the gun, which Bull, unsurprisingly, grabs. There's a struggle, and the rifle strikes the top of the gate, discharging as it does so into Bull's chest. Afterwards, there seems little dispute that Stagg did what he could to save Bull, rushing for a doctor, and even picking up a policeman on the way. His subsequent actions don't seem those of a calculated murderer, determined to kill his neighbour. The jurors would have had to weigh up Stagg's account against that of the principal prosecution witness, Tommy Bull's widow Beatrice, which, as we heard in episode 2, contained several inconsistencies and almost certainly untruths, including the key claim that Bull was hit by the first shot and the second was fired at her. But Stagg's assertion that Bull was drunk was denied by several witnesses, including the club trainer, who testified to his sobriety. Stagg's further implication that Beatrice acknowledged that her husband beat her was also rebutted in court. And it would have counted against Stagg that there was a futile attempt to hide the remains of the 2 cartridges in the fireplace of his house. It was an ill-conceived effort, as enough debris from the shots remained in the garden to evidence where the gun had been fired. An ex-policeman like Stagg would surely have known not to use such an obvious hiding place, which indicates perhaps a well-intentioned effort from his wife Mary to lessen the trouble her husband was facing. Her subsequent silence, no matter what its justification, was used against him. Stagg's defence always maintained that the killing was an accident, but an argument of self-defence would seem to fit the circumstances more closely. The choice of the defence was undoubtedly driven by Stagg, whose first declarations were made without legal advice. He struck vigorously to his position, insisting that no one else should speak on his behalf. It didn't work. Was Stagg mentally unstable? It seems highly likely that he would have been suffering some kind of undiagnosed trauma associated with his time on the battlefields, like so many of his compatriots. Although the psychologist who assessed him prior to his conviction found him fully fit to stand trial, intriguingly, Stagg did not end up spending most of his term in prison. He was transferred to Broadmoor, the most well-known secure psychiatric hospital in Britain, in 1927. Prior to this, we know he had continued to protest against his sentence, going on hunger strike in 1926 and being subjected to the intensely painful procedure of force feeding, typically involving being strapped to a chair while a rubber tube was rammed down the throat. The experience seems to have been unpleasant enough to stop him repeating the protest, but can have done little to have improved his mental state. We don't know exactly what condition led him to be transferred out of the mainstream prison system. Those records will not be released for many decades, but he stayed in secure treatment facilities until 1963, when he successfully petitioned to be moved to the mental health unit at Highfield Hospital, just a few miles from Villa Park. He died there in 1966, aged 87. A few short seconds transformed George Stagg from one of many war heroes, battling bravely to bring up a family in the world they had fought to protect, into a serious criminal, convicted of an attack on an emblem of that new society. He never once denied responsibility for killing Bull, but he always, as far as we know, maintained it was an accident. His place in history will remain that of a murderer, and there seems no prospect it will ever change. Almost half his life was spent behind bars. But would his fate have been different had the man with whom he had argued not been a famous sportsman who left behind a sympathetic widow to frame the story of that night? I believe so. You can make up your own mind. Of course, there are other ways to tell the story. And, as with any life, there is so much more than can go into a single podcast. If If you do want to know more about George Stagg or Tommy Ball, please buy Colin Brown's book, The Armistice Day Killing. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and tell your friends. The soundscape for this podcast was created by Sasha Sadikov for Historius Media, where stories build bridges. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.